I think we are ready to get started. So once again, welcome everyone to the GA4 and TapClicks Customer Office Hours. My name is Angela Hicks, and I'm the Director of Education and Training here at TapClicks. And more importantly, I'm joined today by Brian Butler, who is the CEO and co-founder of SmartTech, and also a GA4 expert and a TapClicks partner. Hi, Brian.
Hello, welcome. How's everyone?
Doing good today. Thank you so
Glad
much
to
for
hear it.
joining us, Brian. Um, I'm wondering, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about SmartTech, your experience with TapClicks, and of course, your experience with GA4?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my experience goes back pretty far. I'm a 15-year vet in the digital marketing space. I've helped run and build 2 agencies in the digital advertising space. So I have a lot of hands-on knowledge working in the systems. We onboarded TapClicks about 6 years ago and ended up quickly kind of becoming a subject matter expert with the platform. And then from that standpoint, really kind of working with the team to become a partner specialist. We have the unique opportunity of being the exclusive US partner for the small business market. So if small businesses, are looking for TapClick services, sales and support, they can come to SmartTech, and we allow access to the TapClicks dashboard for what we call our economy of scale pricing, because as a partner agency, we get a little bit different access, which is really exciting. And we have a lot of experience working with the platform. I'm also really excited because I actually do a lot of training and implementation with new clients on board. So a lot of times if you onboard with TapClicks, you might get me as one of your initial onboarding trainers. And then as well as helping here. I've been doing digital marketing, like I said, for 15 years. I've been in Google Analytics probably for about 12 of those 15 years, and certified in GA and what it takes to kind of run the good platforms. Have been working with Google Analytics since it was initially launched, where they were trying to bring in mobile and app into one property, and then those kind of merged into one, which was GA4 essentially. So I have a fair amount of experience in this, which is great for anybody who has questions. I usually explain my work as we do the stuff that people hate. We do a lot of the GA, Google Tag Manager implementations, enhanced conversions, Google Analytics 4, smart connector building, report building, HubSpot building. We're a HubSpot certified partner as well, so we do a lot of the HubSpot backend. So any of the stuff that you really don't want to take a lot of time to do, that's typically why people hire us, is because we'll come in and really kind of maximize your time and make sure that we can help you scale, which is really exciting.
Awesome. Brian, again, so glad you're here. Thank you for that intro. We are going to talk about GA4 today. And for those of you that joined us last week, you might notice that our themes for today are a little different. So thank you, everyone, when you registered. For those of you that put in questions, that is great. Since this is an office hour, you are welcome to ask questions. If you want to grab some water, tea, or coffee, and we're just going to talk all about GA4 today. So we're going to start. Again, there were a lot of questions around kind of the differences between Universal Analytics and GA4. I know a lot of people have been working with Google Analytics for many, many years, and now GA4, it's new to all of us. So Brian, we'll talk a little bit about Universal Analytics versus GA4. Then I believe you have some tips for GA4 post-migration. So
Yep.
after July 1, here we all are. You'll share those tips with us. Again, more questions about data in GA4. Specifically, there were quite a few questions that came in about conversions and revenue. Then we'll talk about TapClicks template tips and custom dimensions. We've got a lot to cover today, so without any further ado, if there are any questions, feel free to put those in the chat or use the Q&A feature just at the bottom of your controls there. I would love to make this an interactive experience for everyone. So when you have questions, that is why we're here, and we'll do our best to answer whatever we can today. If not, we will definitely follow up with answers for you. So Brian, let's get
Yep.
into Google Analytics versus GA4. I guess
Absolutely.
at a high level, maybe you can tell us a little bit of the differences between these two.
Absolutely. And I do actually have a blog post that I've done on this topic. So I can put it in the chat if anybody wants to access it. I'll put it in everybody so people can see. I won't be following this exact model, but there are some really great examples in the blog that talk about, this almost explicit question. But I said that the summary really of GA4 versus GA-UA. Some people call it GA3. I think it's really kind of irrelevant. GA4 is definitely going to be the new one. So the big differences are essentially Google is moving away from what's considered a pixel cookie tracking type of system, where everything is tracked based off of a cookie, and that cookie is then based into a system that Google reads, and from that standpoint, they can kind of track the user's behavior. I'm not sure if everyone knows the iOS 14 updates that happened, but ever since then, Apple has become a lot more strict when it comes to privacy. I'm sure anybody who runs marketing campaigns saw their Facebook performance drop by 30 to 40%. After the GA or after the Apple update happened. And that's because the cookie tracking essentially got deprecated so badly that if you're on Safari, you're not able to be tracked. If you're on an iPhone, on a Bing browser, on Safari, you're not able to be tracked. A lot of those core values are really gone in the essence of what we consider cookie tracking. So when Google came back to the drawing board, they said, okay, we need to figure out how to unify the Google Analytics experience between apps, mobile, desktop, and then came iOS 14, where they said, okay, crap, now we have to unify this without using cookies. So the cookieless environment is definitely coming down the road. I actually just saw an update that said iOS 17 is going to remove the ability for Apple to pass along GCLIDs, Google Click Identification Numbers. So if you haven't read on that yet, that's going to be a big deal. Anybody who is using GCLIDs for Salesforce connections and bringing that Salesforce data back into Google should likely be talking to their developers about enhanced conversions and how Salesforce and enhanced conversions are going to work together. There's a lot going on with that, but that's a whole nother webinar, frankly. With all that being said, though, it's important to recognize that GA versus GA4 has a number of pretty dramatic differences. So without cookies being able to be our focal point, the main element here is really about event-based tracking, and GA4 is looking more at the user level, whereas GA-UA was looking at the session level. So in GA-UA, you could set up what's called a user ID. So if you had someone log into your GA account and that created a user ID, you could create a unified session where that user ID would be able to take all the sessions from that user, regardless of device they logged in on, and it could create a little bit of a better user journey. Well, if you think of that being the model, GA4 is kind of that model put into play, where GA4 is having event-based actions where it tries to emulate that user ID and says, okay, well, this, user who's logged in, we have permission to track, is made these certain events on the page. And those events, essentially led us through a process where you have page views, you have event clicks, you have video views, you have form fills, and all these different things essentially paint a picture of a roadmap for you. And so how Google Analytics has started doing this with the new GA4 functionality is really leveraging that data in a much more kind of holistic way. And so they're using as a standard data-driven attribution, not last non-direct click attribution. So the big differences there are last non-direct click essentially is a conversion is giving credit to a source of information that was clicked within the last 7 days that wasn't a direct click. And if it's a direct click in the last 7 days, it will go to direct as your source. So a lot of people didn't realize with GA, if you even had a Google paid ad that came in, but then they didn't come back for 7 days and they came and clicked on direct actually got the credit for that last click. The other challenge there is that Google Analytics tracks your conversion of the date of conversion, whereas in Google Ads, it tracks it as of the date of click. So oftentimes people would try to look at their Google Analytics data and they compare it with Google Ads and go, why isn't it matching? Well, Google Ads is giving credit to the date of click, which is usually about 60 days to 90 days backwards if you look at your attribution window with the full 90-day option on. So understanding that with GA4 being data-driven, the data-driven element is way more dynamic. It literally looks at the data and gives partial credit to different attributes and different users that are in that platform. I can tell you, we moved a client of ours to GA4 as a source of truth for tracking versus GA, and we had almost a 30% lift in conversions for our source of truth for Google Ads, because we actually got better credit because most of those sales weren't being attributed to direct. So Google Analytics for being event-based is a lot more tangential in the fact that you're actually looking at each individual action, and it's trying to put together basically a roadmap for you. So the events are a big element there that I would say that's a huge change. GAs as an event action. You're looking at a big option there. Also, automatic tracking of events is also another big function. So if your website has video scrolling, if it has form fills, there's a lot of functions that Google Analytics 4 can actually automatically track those events and put those as events into the system. I will say it's important, though, that you recognize that events are not goals and events are not conversions. So you have to kind of rethink about how you approach Google Analytics and Google Analytics 4 from a goal and conversion standpoint. Goal essentially is going to be the new conversion. So you're going to have your event that lines up in the system. You go into the backend, you turn on that event as a conversion essentially, and that conversion is now going to be your replacement of what used to be a goal. And that functionality is a little bit confusing because the best way to create those events actually is through Google Tag Manager. You can create them in the system, but the accuracy has been yet to proven as extremely accurate. That I would say the interface is also massively changed. Google Analytics, I feel, was built for people who weren't marketers to go in and look at data. Whereas, unfortunately, I feel like Google Analytics 4 is kind of the opposite. It's been built for people who aren't marketers, or for marketers who understand how to build more complex reports. But someone who isn't necessarily a marketer by trade is going to have a really hard time understanding what they're looking for. And they're going to see very limited data to begin with. And they're going to have a very hard time visualizing that data into anything useful without taking some real serious time to invest in training and going through a bit of an education gap with the new system, because the metrics have changed, the changes of the formatting has changed. There's no longer views. So it's very much different than what your standard GA system is.
So, Brian, in hearing just how different all of these things that have changed, one of the questions that's come in is how do you perhaps go about explaining to your clients about these differences? Is it really about the more like user-centric world that we're living in with GA4? What's kind of your high-level point when you're working with clients that are trying to make sense of these differences?
So I start out with commonalities. So you still have audiences, so you can create really good audience reports. They're actually a little more granular now. I also typically will look at sessions as my source of truth versus total users or users. I mean, new users is a good field and users matter. However, it is a bit confusing when you try to understand like all the different elements. So like when I build reports in TapClicks, what I'll typically use is sessions as my source of truth, because I find that sessions matches the best when you log in to like Google Analytics 4. You go through the basic navigation, and then you look at the previous system, sessions were the primary metric. However, I do tell people like sessions is not necessarily apples to oranges. It's really like apples to green apples, or Gala apples to Honeycrisp. The metric itself has the same name. It's still an apple, but the dimensions of that apple are so much different that it is hard to look at a continuous session, trend line and not recognize fluctuations in the numbers, right? Because the sessions that are tracking with GA are going to be a lot different than the sessions that are tracking with Google Analytics, mainly because that session is counted very differently without the cookie there. And so it's a minute difference, but it is a difference. So I usually explain to clients, sessions are still something we can count. There is going to be a small difference in your variables. So as you're looking year over year at these numbers, now that we have blended reports so we can actually use GA and GA4 data together, those blended data sets are going to be valuable, but they are going to be skewed to a point. So it's just really kind of level setting expectations that, yeah, this is going to be valuable, but it isn't going to be one-to-one. The other thing I would say is important, how I would say I usually explain to this, is that you should expect, if you're e-commerce, that your actual revenue tracking is not going to match day of. and it may not ever match. And the reason why is because a lot of people are buying off of apps. A lot of people are buying off of Shopify apps. A lot of people are buying off of Safari, and any of those systems where their cookies are being blocked are going to make it to where it's very challenging for that data to be correctly tracked in Google Analytics. I usually consider desktop sessions and mobile sessions and like app sessions to be very specifically different when it comes to how you look at it. So if you think of a desktop and mobile, it's essentially your plumbing in your house, right? But your app traffic is your electrical. And it's very challenging for your electrical and your plumbing to ever come together and have the same information shared, right? If your plumbing and your electrical meet, you're probably going to have a house that's burned down, right? So it's really challenging because how mobile SDKs work is very different in how it functions than your desktop and your mobile. So those two data streams are very different in GA4 and how those line up. I see we do have a question.
Sorry, let me pull that up.
Kathy has a hand raised.
I am sorry. I am not seeing that, Brian.
Yeah, I think because I'm the view co-host, I'm seeing it. One attendee. Kathy, allowed to talk. Did it work?
I think so.
I think she may put her hand down. Oh,
Kathy, let us know what your question is. You're welcome to come off mute or type in the chat, whatever you prefer.
talking permitted, so she should be good.
And I now see another
I'm
question.
okay. Thanks, guys.
There you are.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I'm good. I hit it by accident.
Okay, well, welcome, Kathy. I'm going to move on. We do have another question I do see in the Q&A section. So can you explain how the user ID is linked to GA4 event tracking? And does that mean that users logged into Google products are being tracked? You have to be logged in for that.
Yeah, so both, I would say. So user ID is actually a metric that would be considered a custom dimension. And so, like, for example, if you have an e-commerce cart, and that e-commerce cart has a, let's call it a transaction number, right? Your developer can set up that transaction number as what's called a data layer variable. And that data layer variable can then be passed through as a custom metric into your Google Analytics 4 account. So it isn't that it's linked to an event necessarily, but it's actually a data layer variable that's passed through as a custom dimension that you'd be able to use as, again, like a custom area. And does it mean that Google users are being tracked? I mean, the basic answer is yes. If you're logged into Google and you have not gone into the settings and turned off the tracking, it's called personalized advertising, then you are absolutely being tracked every time you log in. And it's not only that, but every system you're logged into. So your Google Home, your Google Apps, your Google Now, anything that uses Google as a login. So if you have access to a store, for example, and you use Google as your login, Google uses all that data to make decisions on what advertising to show you and what metrics to show you. But it also means that if you opt out of personalized advertising, they are not typically able to see your session in Google Analytics. So it's more important in the UK, where there is a lot more, actually UK and California have a lot more stringent privacy rules, where it is a opt-in only, not a opt-out methodology. And so there are ways where companies are saying, if you refuse to, if you are automatically tracked in our system, but if you opt out, you are basically accepting that you're going to be tracked. And so some companies have done it in a way where they're basically using the kind of reverse logic on it. But I mean, when you go to any website, you have most of the times you see a cookie acceptance at the bottom, and that's considered first party cookies. What is being effectively moved out is third-party cookies. Like you would typically get like third-party, second-party, and first-party cookies in a lot of cases where you're collecting that data directly, most of the times can be shared. And that's essentially what you have happening with Facebook and Google with enhanced conversion and with Facebook and conversion API. Those are essentially using a server to pass along first-party cookies so that the system has the ability to keep that user in its log, essentially. Hopefully that helps. And if I need to go into more detail, let me know.
So, Brian, what comes to mind for me with GA4, it just sounds like Google is getting better and better at stringing the user's journey together across applications. As we bounce around from different devices, go to different sites. So that's really kind of my takeaway from hearing about how
It is.
users are being tracked.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the big takeaway there, is that what Google is using not an omni-channel approach to make sure that it's tracking as much data as it can. And GA4 with its event tracking gives it more of that ability, versus what is somewhat of a limitation with cookies is that it doesn't have the ability to track that user with a cookie, because users are not necessarily identifiable even with a hashed ID, or like an encrypted ID. Whereas the event ID and the tracking that they do GA4 gets is a little bit more actionable in what it uses and the data access. So if you think about it this way, if you ever upload a list of emails to Google and you say, okay, Google, this is our customer list, and we want you to deprecate anybody who clicks on one of our ads that is on our customer list. We don't want you to show an ad to them. We want you to show organic, right? Because you can do that in Google Ads, where you basically use a customer match list to exclude people. How it's doing that is it's taking that email address that you upload, it's identifying what the encrypted, user ID is of that. And then from that standpoint, if that user does a Google search, it's going to deprecate that to not show an ad. It's a very similar functionality with GA4 in the fact that it uses similar methodology, similar backend tracking to recognize that user and then string those events together.
Fantastic. So, Brian, we've been talking about these differences between Google Analytics as we used to know it before migration and now with GA4. Since this is a TapClicks and GA4 office hour, I would love to kind of shift gears and talk a little bit about, now that everyone's getting their GA4 data into TapClicks, maybe some tips that you have about using TapClicks and GA4 together.
Sure. Let's see here. So do me a share my screen, because I actually have an example I can pull up.
Yes, that would be great. And just one more question while you're pulling up your screen, Brian. Is there any data on how many people opt out of personalized advertising? My guess is that Google keeps that pretty close to the heart, since it's their data, their platform. But I don't know. Have you seen any information about that?
Have I seen any information on that specifically? I would say that we have not seen a specific report as to what's happening on that. And I think, to your point, it is probably because of the fact that Google and Facebook both don't really want you to know that number. Because if you understood how many people are actually opting out, you may find that tool less valuable. And I think that's the short of it, essentially. So yeah, I don't know if there's been a lot of statistics, but the forecast before iOS 14 or 15 hit was it was going to be like 35% of people were going to opt out. I don't know that that's actually been ever validated or verified.
Thank you.
Yeah. So
TapClicks, yeah.
TapClicks, yeah. So there's a couple things to think about when you're bringing off, your migration from GA to GA4. So maybe I'll talk real quick about some recommendations for that, and I'll move into how that works with your reporting. So for GA to GA4, the first thing to think about when you're doing your migration, if you haven't done it yet, we are starting to get notifications from Google that certain clients have their data no longer being recorded for GA. Now, that wasn't happening immediately like Google said it would, but it is starting to come in, and we're starting to get warnings from people saying, hey, you're done. Basically, you're cut off. So before that, really takes play, I would recommend going in there. There's a really great tool called the Audience Manager, where you can go into a Google Sheet, download the audiences into a Google Sheet, and then use the Audience Manager. I think it's a plugin or an app extension for Google Sheets, and then it'll actually import that same audience qualification into GA4. Now, there are certain audiences you can't import, especially ones that use like custom audiences or custom metrics. Those can't be imported, but a lot of them can. So I'd recommend doing that. The other thing is really going through and making sure your referral exclusions are connected and your referral exclusions are copied over to GA4. That's a pretty big one that most people don't necessarily think about. And I think it's valuable to understand, like, that referral exclusion list is super valuable. You want to include that in GA4. The next tip I would say is really making sure that you're, I'm going to say this with respect, don't let your web developer be lazy. A lot of times people think you just have to update your GA4 code to the new session code and not update any of the JavaScript that goes and play with it. But if you have e-commerce and you're not updating the JavaScript to make sure that you're accurately tracking the new GA4 e-commerce variables, it's only going to track very limited data. We had an example I used last call where we had a client who literally had 50% less orders in GA4 than they did GA. And it was because the developer got lazy. He implemented the GA4 data stream ID inside Tag Manager, but didn't change any of the plugins, any of the functions, any of the JavaScript that actually passed along the GA4 e-commerce data layer variables into GA4. So you had to really go in there and customize, like, what just happened. So he actually ended up having the old GA data variables, which was only capturing one of the product sales, not the entire order. So he would get one item counted of 10 that were ordered, right? And so his GA4 was looking like it was just nothing, like it was decimated. But going in there and really calling the developer out and saying, hey, this wasn't done right, and making them go through and make sure that their plugins were up to date, make sure that their enhanced e-commerce code was put in right. That all had to be done pretty quickly before the transition. Otherwise, his data in GA4 would have been completely useless because he would only been tracking like one product. So really make sure that you're double checking your purchases. Like, look at your day-to-day and say, okay, what's Google Analytics 4 reporting? There is going to be a difference. Probably 10 to 15% of your sales are not going to count in GA4 because of the cookie deprecation and because of user tracking. You know, if they didn't opt in, they're not going to be tracked. So be mindful of that, but also be mindful of the fact that you want to make sure that those transactions that are being counted, the entire transaction is being counted, because it is a huge problem. Do you want to answer the question we have come up, or real quick before we move into the dashboard?
Yeah, I think so. So with GA4 and Google BigQuery, so if you have an integration between those two, what does that integration look like versus the data that we get into TapClicks? So I guess to simplify, what data can we get into TapClicks from GA4 might be another way that I ask this question.
I mean, I would say yes, there are some fields that are missing. And I would say that it's not necessarily, so let me clarify this correctly. So when you bring in your data into TapClicks, TapClicks has created a really cool function where it has the ability to bring in, I think it's like up to 8 years of GA UA data, and it stores that as like a data lake. And that data lake is accessible for any of the reporting that you need. For some, I think some situations, clients have bought it as part of their onboarding. Others, if you're an older client, I can tell you, me personally, I ended up paying like $300 for the engineers to go in. All my clients, they pulled like 5 years of data back so I could look at a 5-year look back window. And that information was stored and it was kept easily. So what happens with BigQuery is you take your GA3 data, you import it into BigQuery, and then you use BigQuery to store that data. And then you'd have to use the BigQuery connector to import that data back in. However, I will say, I feel like TapClicks has kind of made that process irrelevant for people who have TapClicks. If you don't have TapClicks, which most of you probably will because you're on this call, but if you don't have TapClicks, BigQuery is one of your only ways currently that I found in the market to actually create a data lake with your GA3 data that you want to warehouse. If you have TapClicks, they will do that for you for the last 5 to 8 years. And the cost is nominal compared to hosting all your data in BigQuery. But if you do have BigQuery, you can use the smart connector to bring your GA data from BigQuery into TapClicks. Now, where the difference in the metrics, the field, and the dimensions that you asked about in TapClicks, there is metrics that are currently yet to be mapped from the API for GA4 into TapClicks. And it's not a measurement of TapClicks isn't willing to do it. It's been in beta for years now, literal years. And TapClicks is one of the first companies to have access to that beta. And the initial data views that they had access to were what was available through the API. But as the API has started to become more robust, now that GA3 has been sunset, you can see quickly that GA is starting to roll out more and more and more data. So one example of that is, something that TapClicks is constantly trying to work on is product level data, item level data, right? I don't know that right now, as we speak, item level data is available in stored data, though I think it's coming. And I don't even know that it's available in live data quite yet. But it's because there's so many updates happening to the API, and it's been in beta for so long that TapClicks is working pretty much consistently to keep up with that process. So if there are metrics that you are looking at in your report and you're like, you know what, I really want to see transaction item, I want to see item ID, transaction ID, I want to be broken out, my revenue by transaction ID. That may be something that's challenging to show right now. And if you need that, raise it to attention of your CSM and to have them talk to the engineering team about where that lives and if they can get it, as part of a live connector or if they can get it as part of a stored connector. I will say a lot of the data that I don't have access to yet in a stored connector are currently available in the live connector. So you have to kind of look at the two, and I can maybe explain more about the live connectors here in a moment because it's a newer function, because that is a very, very valuable element that I think is really important for you guys to know about.
Yeah, Brian, I definitely want to talk more about the live versus stored data in a moment, but I just wanted to say we have on tapclicks.com on our website a way for you to see all of the fields and how they're organized in different data views. But ultimately, if there is some fields that's not available to you, please talk to your CSM. We're all still building things out for this GA4 connector. And we do not turn on every last thing. As you know, you have a lot of data for each one of your clients when it comes to GA4. So just to keep things streamlined and optimized,
Yep.
we kind of streamline your instance and make sure that everything runs smoothly. So if you're missing something, please talk to your customer success manager. So with that, tapclicks.com page, I'm just going to post in the chat so everyone can bookmark this if you'd like to. But
Yep.
that page on tapclicks.com/connectors, you're going to be able to see all of the connectors we have. So you could search for GA4 and you would find all of the fields, the data views, and we're going to talk more about live versus on-demand data, but you'll see that on our website as well.
Yep. Yeah. So when you're building your report, you're going to see a collection of different live widgets and then different widgets that are stored data widgets. And I'll show you how to view that in the system. But just to get an idea, when you're in the connectors page, and if you are currently a TapClicks client and you don't have this page bookmarked, you're doing yourself a disservice because there's a ton of information available in here. I was on a call day before yesterday when I described this as a toolbox, right? If you bring a toolbox into your home and that toolbox has the first two drawers filled with 99% of all the tools you'll ever need, it's going to be a lot lighter than if you filled that toolbox, every single drawer with every tool that was possibly ever going to be needed. And if you're trying to use that toolbox as a mobile toolbox and move it around your garage, that weight is going to start to become really heavy. So the system is loaded up with 99% of the metrics you're ever going to need. And it doesn't overload the system with all the metrics available because the load time for that data to parse in every morning would be extravagantly long. I think I can tell you personally, my data that I have pulled in after 6 years and a very, very heavy workload, it takes an average of 6 hours for my Google data to sync and complete every morning. So it's something where if you load up that toolbox with every tool available just because, you could find issues with, people doing cost checks in the morning and having data not be fully transparent for yesterday because it just hasn't finished loading. So that being said, this is a careful, a training. There's a lot of data available in here. I do not recommend having every single data view turned on because again, it's going to take 6 hours in the morning for this thing to load, right? You don't want that. So you want to kind of pick and choose what you need and what you actually use. So you have stored data and then on-demand data. The stored data essentially is going to be accessible data that has been stored in TapClicks' data warehouse, and that is usually accurate up until usually yesterday, I would say. It takes, sometimes between 30 seconds to 6 hours, depending on who you are, for that data to finish parsing. But once it's been finished, it's usually accurate till about yesterday because they pull this data at 12 midnight Eastern Standard Time. If you are looking at on-demand data, these metrics are actually going to be pulling directly from the source of truth, and you're not going to have the same data lag. The benefit behind stored data is it goes back really far if you want it to. If you get your CSMs to go in there and backfill data, or if you're using smart connectors, you can go really, really far back. If you're using an on-demand, like a live widget, you can only go back whatever the core look back window is of that system. I think TapClicks' Google Analytics, I think it's 14 months, but don't quote me on that. So there's a couple of benefits, there's a couple of downsides, but really the on-demand widgets are for things where you need information that's accurate as of right now. This week to date, for example, could be a good metric that you use for on-demand, or if it's a situation where you have metrics that are in here that are not available to you in the stored data. And to answer your question before you ask it, no, there isn't a list of metrics that are available in one but not the other. I've not seen that yet, and I don't know that that's on the way. But as you're looking for data, this is kind of how you would go in, find the data in here. You can Control F and find in here. And then when you click mouse over one of these fields, you can actually see all the data views that these fields are available in. If you wanted to try to go find that in your system. So going back to the report real quick, it's important to understand what you're using and why it's valuable. I actually made some pretty distinct changes to our GA4 template. The GA4 template, if you want to find it, can be available in your sections. It's available here under your most popular sections typically. And I will say that the initial one that was built out with a couple of bugs in it. So if you have one that was, one of the initial templates, I just remove it and then add the new one in, because the new one actually has a lot more of the bugs fixed. So that's, kind of a first step. But then I customized the top section pretty aggressively. So as a user, we had a lot of clients come to us and be like, I'm looking in Google Analytics 4 and I'm not really seeing matching data to what you're showing in your reports. I don't feel like your reports are accurate. And so what that ended up causing was doubt, right? It's like, oh no, what's happening? Because the challenge is the initial setup is done with total users, and a couple of other engagement rate metrics that are not necessarily easily found in GA4. So what you have to kind of do if you want to match is you have to customize this a little bit. First of all, what I did here is I actually made it to where we're using the properties data view, not the acquisition data view, because the acquisition data view did not have the sessions, new users, engaged users, engagement rate, and conversions all available in one data view like I needed. So I actually removed the initial ones. I added the properties, and then I added the sessions, new users, engaged users, which if you look in GA4 and you look at the only provided template report, this is essentially matching that report verbatim. And so when your clients are looking at this, the customization here is essentially helping you to say one-to-one, one-to-one, one-to-one. Okay, things match. That's great. Move on. It just prevents issues, provides more confidence, a little more stability. The other thing that I tried to understand here is, when I looked at this, for me, sessions and users were essentially showing almost the same number, whereas total users and sessions was not. And so when you log into GA4, total users is a field you have available in the API, but it isn't a field you directly will see in GA4 unless you get into really custom reports. And the definition of what total users is versus sessions is pretty different. And so for me, I found that total users versus sessions for me was way more accurate towards what my clients wanted and what my clients were reporting. So I changed up a lot of the views here. So instead of having cross-network, direct, display, email done by total users, I did it by sessions. And for my clients, at least, that was a more continued copacetic experience, I would say. I also, you have the event breakdown in here. You have page performance. You have a couple of different functions that I do recommend really kind of, just tweaking to your own benefits and making sure. The other one is e-commerce. A lot of the standard reports that are built for GA4 don't have an e-commerce element. When I find, at least, depending on your niche, e-commerce is a very, very important function. So I actually recommend creating a variant of your GA4 report that is an e-commerce variant that has total revenue, it has conversion, it has transactions built in, total revenue built in by event, by channel grouping. It really kind of helps you to understand that data. So I would recommend customizing this to make sure that you're having a more synergistic, copacetic relationship between GA4's interface and what you're showing on the report, because I feel like you're going to get a lot less challenges from your client as far as why isn't this data matching.
Brian, I love all these customized examples that you're showing us. We built templates at TapClicks, so it's a starting point, and this is
Yep.
exactly what we're hoping for all of our users to do, to customize it to the nth degree, for your clients, for how you want it to look and feel and report. So I really love hearing all of these things that you've changed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I turned off I turned on some demo data so we could actually look at the more of the report functions. There was an area down here, I think it was between engagement and event breakdown, that was essentially it had a lot of engagement rate metrics that were just not matching up or lining up. So I actually removed those as well. And then for page performance, I added the revenue, average purchase revenue. I also updated these to be more session focused and view focused. Then here you have GA4 live calls. So the GA4, again, live calls, if you go into one of your systems here, you'll notice that you have the option to do a stored data cloud or not the data cloud. So if you were to map or click on this toggle, it would put this into data cloud mode, which is the stored data. If you unclick the toggle, it puts it into live call data. So what that then does is puts you into a different sort of build widget. I guess it's like a different sort of build mechanic where you build, you assign where you're showing here. So this would be that client that you're doing, or that profile, and then you would make sure your metrics, dimensions are prepared, and then from down here you would actually figure out your filters for what you're doing. The one thing that is not super clear in the filters is it is wildcard dependent. So if you wanted to use your asterisks and create your contains variable wildcards, you actually can do that in the same way you would with a stored filter on a stored widget. So that it doesn't explicitly come out and say you can use wildcards here, but you can, and it does help with the overall filtering function. So be mindful of that. That's a really big one. And then if you come in and do a, let's see here, I'm trying to think. If you do some customizations, you can do a lot of the similar customizations as you could for a stored widget. The difference is you're using live data. The one thing I will say is that when you do a live data widget, it does typically take longer to load that first time because it's pulling that information directly from the platform.
Right. And Brian, with that link that I shared earlier, the tapclicks.com/connectors, you will see that as a tab for on-demand data. So on-demand, live, that's the same thing that we're talking about here.
Yep.
So there's a question, if you can filter by streams in each data view.
Filter by streams.
Streams.
So you created the stream that's similar, like basically like a view at this point. That's a fair question. I don't know if you can. I don't know if streams is a dimension that you can pull in, though. I do remember that when I had worked with GA UA, you could pull in account ID, like the Google, the GID. So I would think you might be able to pull in stream as a filterable dimension. I don't really know. Let's take a look here at the system here and look up stream.
Spoiler, we do have a data view for streams.
Do you? Is it a full data view?
There's a full data view. Yep.
So let's see here, down here. Here we go. Yeah. So data view details, stream. And then under here, you have all the metrics that would be available as part of the stream data view. So the answer to that question would be yes. And you have a full data view that probably would need to be turned on by your customer account manager. I'm trying to see if, yeah, it's an on-demand one. Is it also available in stored data? Let's take a look. Yep, stream details is also available in stored data. So, but as you can see, immediately the amount of metrics that are available to you in the stored are, very, very quickly, finished. But if you go into the on-demand here, back down to streams, this goes a lot longer. So if I were someone building a stream focused widget, I would definitely use the live on demand call, because you have, looks like 3 to 4 times the available metrics available to you.
Yeah, just
I mean,
more
it just
more
keeps going.
available.
So that's a really good example of why you would use a live call widget versus an in-stream widget, is just the available metrics available to you in that data view. Did that answer the person's question well enough?
I think
Let's
so,
see.
but if you have
All
more
right.
questions, feel free to put them in. Oh, we got a
Yes. All right.
yes.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, so with this template, I was wondering if you had any more tips for customizing. We've talked about live data,
Yep.
and using the group by dimensions, but is there anything else you want to show us on this template that maybe might not be apparent?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of small things, and this is maybe more of a user function that a lot of people don't realize, is a lot of people who aren't on GA4 yet, if you build a master template that has a GA4 widget in it, and that person doesn't have GA4, you may not want a blank report to show. So what I would say is that it's not necessarily, I mean, if you've gone through the in-depth training, this should be knowledge that you know, but in case you don't, there is the ability to actually turn off empty widgets in the system to make sure that you're not having empty widgets show when someone doesn't have that source of medium. The other option is under manage sections. Your GA4 can actually be assigned to a section as the data source. And so what that does for you, if you haven't experienced this before, is when you come in as a client or as a user who's viewing your report as a client, and that client doesn't have GA4 yet, this template will basically, or this version of the template will essentially hide, so that you're not showing a blank report with no data. That's a really, really big benefit. The other tip and trick that I like to teach people on this one is, I mentioned this on the last call too. If you go into the headers here, the TapClicks Pro Services team does an excellent job at building headers. And a lot of times people don't realize how to do this, but you can come into the code and you can actually copy this widget or publish this to your library. And then you can edit the color gradient on the background to your own branded colors. So if you wanted to customize this from the Google Analytics colors, or you wanted to make it a Google or Facebook specific colored background, you could actually do that in the code by just updating your linear gradient and then updating the hex codes so that they are gradiating through those two colors. It's a very small thing, but I mean, it allows this entire widget to be saved on your own color palette. You can publish this to the library and use it again. And then you can also come in, obviously, and edit the wording without having to use the code. But very, very handy feature if you haven't experienced how to visually create this beautiful header.
I love saving things to the library. Then it's just putting together Legos, right? You customize
Essentially,
things and then
yeah,
you
publish to
hook it all
library.
together.
Yep, makes it really handy. The other thing I would say is that this may be another just like general tip, but if you're new to GA4 and you haven't really built a lot off of this, I would recommend adding your GA4 overview template to like a demo report. Personally, I subscribe to the model of having a sandbox for all my employees. So I have a sandbox report that all my employees go into, and they can't break it. They can go in there and make new widgets. They can make new sections, and then they could, kind of bench test it to understand like where the limitations are without having to worry that a client's going to log in and see them, working on a half-finished widget. Once they finish that widget in the demo section, or the demo instance or sandbox, they can then save and publish that section, report, or widget to the library, and then put it in their client report. That's the kind of the standard one, right? So for me, I find that that is probably one of your best options for really getting to know this new widget or this new template, is put it into an employee sandbox and go to town and just play with it.
Awesome. Well, Brian, we have just a few minutes left in our office hour. I wanted to take a moment to see if we have any other questions. A question that we had from the registration. So when you create custom metrics in GA4, kind of shifting gears back to data here,
Sure.
can you bring those into TapClicks?
Yes, you absolutely can. And the other custom metric that you can create is an audience metrics. So if you want to create new audience data, you can import that and create views that look at that audience data. If you're bringing in custom metrics that you want to create, you can leverage that. One thing that I want to point out about custom metrics that is important to note is that custom calculations inside of GA3 did not transfer over to GA4. So as an example of that, I had a client where they were using a single goal as their primary source of truth. And they wanted us to look at GA and understand what the cost per conversion was for that goal. And the only way for us to do that was through a custom calculation. We had to make a custom calculation inside GA3 that could take that specific and create like a goal CPA. Well, without that being available in GA4, your custom calculations that you would need to build those kind of functions, you're going to want to rely on the calculation field inside of TapClicks, because you don't have that limitation in TapClicks where you do in GA4 now. So custom dimensions can be imported. Custom dimensions can be added to a calculation, which can then be used to create a custom calculation based on those dimensions and those metrics. So it's where, Google kind of left us hanging with that feature. TapClicks is not, and so it allows us to do what we need to do to maximize, that use case.
Excellent. Thank you for answering that question. I'm going to pause here. I'm just going to put up our last slide. But if you have any more questions, we have just a couple of minutes left. Brian, thank you for sharing such a wealth of information today. But
Pleasure.
with our last few minutes, let's pause here and see if you have any other questions. We will answer those. But if not, I thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day or evening.
If anyone's interested, we do have a couple of different blogs on the website that talk about this stuff if you want to dig in. We also have a couple of presentations that we have available to us if you wanted to see kind of what that looks like. And then with Smart Tech, if you guys do have GA4 and you want to have an audit done to understand what's available to you, participants of the webinar do get a discount on that. So instead of a $500 audit, it would actually be a $450 audit, giving you a little bit of a discount on that. And we have really great developers that we work with who would be able to kind of dig into some of the details and understand maybe where some of the challenges are. So if you're interested, hit me up on LinkedIn or brian@smarttech.company, and we can definitely do what we can to help you build some GA reports or just going into a GA audit and do a deep dive.
Thanks, Brian. And from the TapClicks side, of course, on tapclicks.com, if you were to search for GA4, you're going to find a ton of content, blog posts, knowledge base articles, a couple of videos, as well as, of course, the connectors page that we looked at in depth today. But thanks, everyone. I'm still not seeing any questions. Yeah. So I guess we will call it a day. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time.